some of you I've known for too long, I see. Ian Tomlinson, where are you? Are you alive? He's still alive. I can't believe it. Now, I'm
John Tomlinson. Yeah.
John Tomlinson. I'm delighted to be here for a couple of reasons. One is that I think I should come out on a few issues to do with East Timor. It's timely. And just tell you where it started. It started, in my case, when I was still at law school. I went away for special training. This was when the Australian government recruited its special forces, sometimes from the universities. So from Sydney Law School, I was trained before I left Sydney Law School in certain matters. In part of that specialist training, I met a former second commando from the World War II experience, and he told us of his abiding regard for the East Timorese. I didn't know where Timor Island was, and that was in the late 1960s, and so I left law school and went into a special service of the Australian government. It's not widely known. And we'll move along till 1974-75, when I actually read the cables, particularly the cables that Richard Woolcott sent, proposing that it would be better for Australia to deal with Indonesia than Portugal on the petroleum reserves of the Timor Sea. That was a Sunday afternoon, and I wasn't in the Australian embassy, but I had a diplomatic rank in Paris, for reasons I can't go into still, and I didn't work in the embassy, but on this occasion I'd been asked to go in on the Sunday and monitor the cipher room, which is a secret place embassies occasionally have. And I read dispatches that absolutely appalled me. I couldn't believe that this government, that I think I'd voted for, the Whitlam government, was involved in what was going on. And I remember going home to my wife and saying, I can't believe what I've read this afternoon. So it's all too true that I was trained by a hero of the resistance in Timor, that I knew about the Timorese when I didn't know where the island was, and that I was a convert to their salvation. So that's really where it started. There's a sting to it because eventually the services raid my own chambers, but we'll come back to that. Now, have we treated the island of East Timor, the eastern end, fairly? Well, we haven't. And so I've been working in Cambridge on wider issues to try and expand this very good topic that Stuart's put on tonight. Have we treated them fairly? Don't start in 1974-75 with the Woolcott-Whitlam thing. It doesn't start there. It doesn't start with the death of Australian and British journalists in Ballybough. It goes all the way back, not as far back as the Timor pony in Banjo Patterson's Snowy, Man from Snowy, but you will read in the archives Sir George Pearce's letter to Billy Hughes. Sir William Hughes, the Prime Minister, was due to depart from Sydney in September 1916, and a secret letter was delivered to him, written by Pearce, the Defence Minister, the Australian Defence Minister. And he tells Billy Hughes that the island chain to our north is vital, and the German islands we've captured, which, as you know, we had in 1914, are indisputably to be part of our future island screen, and we must, not only for defence reasons, but for reasons of the fact that one of the islands has significant phosphate deposits, which we need for our farms, and petroleum's not mentioned, of course, and we need you to indicate to the British that we're not going to be dislodged from what we've taken from the Germans. And so that moves on to the peace conference in Versailles in 1919, when Australia positively wants an island screen. Now those of us, you know, you've read about the Japanese Navy escorting our troop ships from Albany, mostly from Albany, sometimes from Sydney and Fremantle to the Cairo, to the Middle East and to Britain in the First World War. That was a sobering experience for white Australia. The Japanese Navy was escorting them. In 1905, Britain had formed a treaty arrangement with Japan so that Japan would come to the aid in naval terms of Britain if the Russians attacked Afghanistan from the north. And George Pearce, our Defence Minister, way back then, shortly after Federation, was uneasy and aware of the British-Japanese alliance, which expressed itself further in the Japanese Navy escorting our troop ships. So, and you can read where Hughes says later in retirement he had very much the Japanese in mind when he argued in Versailles for the grant of all of the German islands and anything else we could get, leaving German Samoa, I think, to the New Zealanders to administer. So they became league trustee territories with parts of Papua New Guinea and Manus Island and those sort of places. So we've always wanted an island screen, and we've wanted to have either to possess for commercial and defence reasons as much as we can to provide us a shield against, as the record shows in those days, expressed as the Yellow Peril. But certainly Japan was in the mind of the Australian delegation at Versailles in 1919. Move along, and then you can read all the papers, and there's a lot written about the invasion of Portuguese Timor in 1942 by the Australian and Dutch forces. A study of those archives, both in Australia and in Britain, shows that it wasn't John Curtin who agreed to the invasion, quote, of Portuguese Timor. John Curtin's been unjustly described as having gone along with the invasion. There's a very long cable to Churchill from Curtin remonstrating about being tricked into what happened. We haven't got enough time tonight, but history has to be kinder to John Curtin over the Australian entry in February 1942 into Portuguese Timor, which destroyed Portugal's neutrality with the Japanese and allowed the Japanese High Command to say that it was justified in entering Portuguese territory because Australia had set up an offensive position against Japan. So that was a tragedy, as we know, and Susan's said it often enough, and I won't go into it. That was a tragedy, as we know, ultimately for the Timorese peoples in terms of the reprisals and deaths. But we didn't let up. The Defence Committee notes in 1947 and 48 in Canberra indicate that we then were already aware of the oil potential, petroleum potential of East Timor. In those terms, it was about the seeps, that is, seepages of oil on the land, nothing about petroleum under the ocean. But we were aware of it. But we're also aware that in the Dutch East Indies there were already significant resources already being exploited. And so Standard Oil, and therefore Washington, and Royal Dutch Shell, and therefore Whitehall, were very interested in the future of the Dutch East Indies and Portuguese Timor, both in terms of the general decolonialisation, but in terms of the petroleum potential of the areas. The further developments are that Dr. Salazar, the Prime Minister of Portugal, had played a very good hand, a very shrewd hand in World War II, because it's not widely known that Sir Anthony Eden was approached by Dr. Evatt, the Australian External Affairs Minister of the day, in 1943 with a request that Portuguese Timor be handed over to Australia after the war. Evatt had flown through Washington and had got Roosevelt's support for that proposition, but Churchill and Sir Anthony Eden and Whitehall squelched it because Salazar had already said that if you want bases in the Azores Islands to ferry your bombers and for the war against the U-boats, the Atlantic U-boats, the Atlantic War, don't give me an assurance that we will get our Portuguese colonies in East Africa, Macau and Timor back after the war. So you can either go with the Australians or you can give up the Azores Islands as a ferrying point for defensive purposes. Smart move. The British went along with it, so did Roosevelt. Roosevelt did write another letter, which I've seen, it's at Kew in the Royal Archives, saying, well, I think, we should seriously consider giving Timor, Portuguese Timor to the Australians to manage with the rest of the stuff after the war. But the British don't go along with that because what happens next? We get the Cold War. And where do we want to operate to monitor the Soviet submarines? We want the Azores. So Salazar plays the same card again during the Cold War. And so there's never going to be Timor being anything but a backwater in the colonial world. At the same time, the United Nations, the numbers in the General Assembly fall over for the West. All in the space of 1 month, about 15 new countries join in the early 60s, and Britain and the United States, France and China and the Soviet Union lose the numbers. Well, the Soviets didn't, but that's another story. You lose the numbers in the General Assembly. So then starts the very strong work of decolonialisation in what was called the Fourth Committee in the UN. That decolonialisation period involved the West needing Portugal in NATO because Salazar was a virulent anti-communist. He joined NATO as fast as he could. He stayed neutral in the Second World War, but he wasn't going to be neutral post-war. So what happened was the West went easy on Portugal, as we know, in Africa, Mozambique, went easy, but the Chinese and the Russians and the other states, Bulgaria and that, constantly harassed Portugal to deal with its human rights records in its colonies. At the same time, Australia had to play Tootsie because we were a colonial power too. We were administering the trust territories in Papua New Guinea and the rest. So we had to line up with Portugal at times in motions against us by the Eastern Bloc and still play a card. Enter the CIA and Alan Dulles. And Freeport and the discovery of the richest gold available known to man up in West Papua in the Freeport mine. So by 1961-62, we've got Kennedy and Alan Dulles, as you know now from Greg Poulgrain's research, running distinct policies. Kennedy wants self-determination for West Papua. The Indonesians want West Papua. Dulles is dealing with the Indonesian generals, trying to get a unified central command in the Indonesian army against Moscow. Kennedy wants self-determination. Portugal's just on the edge of this at the moment. So West Papua really was the litmus test of whether Kennedy would get what he wanted or whether the deep state around Alan Dulles, who was tremendously connected with Standard Oil and the mining lobby, would get West Papua for Freeport and for the Americans, Standard Oil the other. So the CIA was pressing for unified army command with complacent generals who would hate communism and especially Chinese communism, would deal with the Chinese. Kennedy wanted self-determination and he was seen by Alan Dulles to be naive. It's all in the archives now, increasingly available. So Barwick is our External Affairs Minister, Menzies is our Prime Minister. Barwick is dealing with Dulles. The archives show that Barwick was going along with Dulles. We were saying pious things about self-determination, but we were helping the centralised command of the Indonesian army, because the army, Suharto, was very anti-communist. And for show, Dulles didn't oppose the Indonesian Navy and the Indonesian Air Force making arms purchases in Moscow, but they had no real threat. There was no real threat. So Salazar sees this happening, is starting to fight his subversion wars in Angola and that, and he actually writes to Menzies and eventually says to Menzies, do you want to take over Portuguese and administer Portuguese Timor? The current history in this country, the narrative is that Salazar refused to give way. Not true. Not true. Salazar offered Portuguese Timor to us, and Barwick and External Affairs in Canberra advised against it. This will all come out in due course. And so you see the Australian archives are minimal on this period, but the US archives and the Royal Archives in Britain supply the gaps these days. So you've got to go to Washington and you've got to go to Kew to get this history. So we blame Whitlam largely for the takeover. Whitlam's shallow deal with Suharto, in my view, has nothing on the Barwick-Dulles alliance that decided that in 1963, in a secret Australian cabinet decision, that Timor would be better placed with Portuguese Timor with the Indonesians. That's the decision. It wasn't Whitlam making the decision. Whitlam and Woolcott were going along with a pre-existing cabinet position that had not been disturbed and was later largely going to be bipartisan. So there you are. So have we ever been fair? We've never been fair. We've always wanted something up there, an island screen. When the petroleum potential becomes obvious, you know that the Australian Bureau of Mineral Resources, later Geoscience Australia, went along with this absurd two shelves doctrine that isn't supported by the balance of geological opinion. That is, because there are two shelves, Australia controls its entire continental shelf. So what happened was, in the 50s, there was a move to rein in the Japanese pearling industry in our near north, and there was a move to claim the entire continental shelf out to 100 fathoms. Then the idea of petroleum reserves enters the archives, but David Fairbairn, a Conservative Minister for National Development, says it's not fair, we should do a median line with Portugal. He gets rolled in cabinet by Billy Snedden and Barnes, who was then the Territories Minister, and that's a Holt cabinet. It's the Harold Holt cabinet decision that we won't go with a median line. At that time, Britain and Norway had the same issue going, that is, a trough or trench between Britain and Norway, and a median line was the outcome. My leader in the Hague case was one of the advisors in that case, Sir Ellie Louderpack. But Fairbairn, a Liberal Conservative, wanted to do the fair thing with Portugal for the people of East Timor. You can read it. And he was voted down. His submission as Minister for National Development was voted down. Thereafter, successive ministers of national development have always maintained that we should keep running an argument that Fairbairn and the Bureau of Mineral Resources said at that time could not be maintained. That is, there is not a separate shelf. The Australian shelf is going down under East Timor, ironically. Timor is moving closer to Jakarta at 9 or 10 centimetres a year. And so Timor rides on the Australian shelf. The shelf is unbroken. It's not two different land masses, and therefore the law that Australia supported, that is, if there's two coasts, 400, we'll just put it very loosely, 400 k's apart, then it's a median line if the shelf's unbroken, right? Australia clings, Brandis is still clinging to this wacko theory that there's two shelves. If there were two shelves, the subduction and the earthquake zone would be in front of East Timor, between us and East Timor. It isn't. It's north of East Timor. That's where the collision is. So tectonically, we don't have a case. We just cling to it because we've got no other argument for being so outrageous with the Timorese. So we're not being fair. Now, have we been fair since? Well, I spent years getting all this research together. We got a great case together against Australia. It's not a secret anymore, thanks to Senator Brandis, that I've had historically great connections with the Australian defence and intelligence community. I'm a Canberra lawyer. I have a practice there, and I have a background, which I won't go into, which was entirely consistent always with my support for the East Timorese. Consistent because the strongest support for East Timor, in my experience, has always come from the leadership in defence and the intelligence services. Always. Why did you get the massive intelligence leaks in 1999 from defence? Because lies were being told. The reality is, the bad player on the block has always been the Australian Department of External Affairs, latterly the DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And that's been the bad boy on the block, not the defence and intelligence community, right? So it so happens, these funny things happen. I was telling Susan, because I went to a Josephite convent school, and I think they turned me left, I suspect. Well, we won't go into that. But Susan can account for that. But the reality was that a very senior ASIS officer came to me for legal advice, not as a whistleblower, but for advice as to what he thought was unlawful activity, misuse of funds, and particularly in the aftermath of the Bali bombing, when Prime Minister Howard had said we'd leave no stone unturned to get the perpetrators. The fact was, we turned the teams off finding the perpetrators so they could go and bug the poverty-stricken Timorese. So that was a most, you know, I'm in the middle of a murder trial at the moment. There's so many things in my life I've seen and done. But that moment when that senior officer coming to me as a lawyer for advice, because I advise in sensitive areas and had security clearances, etc., was a most amazing moment of my life. I didn't recruit a whistleblower, as that rat Justin Gleeson said in The Hague. It was a client. The client had got clearance from the Inspector General of Security to see me, as they're required to do, and the Inspector General of Security had cleared me to represent this person with respect to the misconduct by Alexander Downer as the ministering the Australian Secret Intelligence Service. And we're not talking about some junior player there. This is not an Edward Snowden, brave though he is. This is not a Manning, brave though she is. This is a very, very senior official coming to me and saying something's got to be done. And what I do is perfectly lawful. But it adds to the case against Australia and allows the Timorese to suddenly make their move. So we make the move, we give them a chance privately to tear the illegally, fraudulently procured treaty up. We give them that chance. That's not public knowledge yet. They're given a chance. Chinana Guzmao, I draft the right letters for Julia, what's her name? Gillard. And we propose that we just let the good bilateral relations continue, just tear the treaty up. We know what you did. Tear it up. What do? As we now know, Mark Dreyfus approves the installation of bugging and clandestine devices throughout my chambers and my home, and the senior officer. There's no way the Labor Party is going to give up on Timor, despite what Brereton, Laurie here, tried to achieve. And then what happens next is we run the arbitration against Australia. As far as we are concerned, this is the team led by Sir Eli Lauderpack, we can't lose this. This will be the first country in the world, in the modern world, committing fraud in treaty negotiations. Maybe there's been fraud before, but this will be the first time they get nailed for it, and the witnesses available. So on the morning we're due for the first procedural hearing in The Hague, I wake up to find ASIO and the police throughout my chambers, coming and going, copying 30 years of my work, a lot of it unrelated to this case, but of interest to the Department of Foreign Affairs. And so that's what Putin was doing about the same month in Moscow to some of his opponents. It's a fact. Putin was doing exactly the same to his opponents as George Brandis and Abbott were doing to myself and witness K. So it was a strange moment to be in court to tell the judges that the other side have just seized our brief. Just ask them what we're going to say. They've got our brief. Now, you don't often see judges on the end of their chair. And the Australian Solicitor General, Gleeson, who says he did this at Brandis's request, off the record in Canberra, Brandis says that it was Gleeson who did it. I don't know who to believe, but the fact of the matter was, between the two of them, they accused our team, including a man with 3 of his students on the International Court bench, Sir Eliu Lauderpack, an 84-year-old man at the time, of criminal conduct. Accused me of criminal conduct, of breaching Australia's national security and putting lives at risk. The only lives that Justin Gleeson put at risk were my staff, my family, because we're all named, because at that time, operatives were being assassinated allegedly because of information that Snowden had given out. He then likened us to Edward Snowden. This is Justin Gleeson, who's tried to preserve himself somewhat by his spat recently with Brandis, but we can't get from either of them whose idea it was. Anyway, the court, of course, we put on an application for the return of our papers. Big deal, they'd read them. Brandis said he wouldn't read them. They'd spent 6 hours in our office reading them, bringing black photocopiers in, copying everything according to our clerk. So Brandis gave an undertaking to court he wouldn't read them. Well, he didn't read them, but everyone else did. So, it's Putinesque. That's our country. And because of the allegation of criminal conduct by myself was concerned, I had to withdraw from the case. And that is not fair. That's not fair at all. And it's a matter still for disciplinary authorities. We'll deal with that at another stage. So finally, I think it's never been anything but a sense of defence, no longer relevant now with ballistic missiles so much. It started off as having an island screen to our north, and then it developed into warped doctrines of national development. That is, we had to have our own petroleum search. As you know, during the Menzies era, we didn't have our own oil in any quantities that could sustain us. So it truly was a critical commodity. We desperately wanted our own oil. There were some discoveries down off the coast in Gippsland and so forth, but if you read the archives and the release documents, you'll see legitimately that in his final election campaign, Menzies said if we could discover oil on the Australian mainland includes the continental shelf, our future worries will be over. So out of that sense of critical demand for petroleum, after the 1972 OPEC thing, you had whisperers like Richard Wilcock getting into Whitlam's ear saying, we're better off dealing with the Indonesians, because by then the CIA had stitched it all over Freeport. You can't look at Timor without looking at West Papua, because the world politic, the American politic, required a bolster against communism, that is, China-hating and communist-hating Indonesian generals, and pliable generals, as we know now. Suharto was getting, what, 3 million a week out of Freeport throughout? And so it's mixed with the seesaw of power in Washington, where JFK really wasn't in charge of the foreign policy in our region, at least. Dulles was. And Barwick going Barwick. So in my estimation, Barwick did the critical turns, that is, deflecting Salazar, who asked us if we'd like to administer Portuguese the same way, Portuguese Timor, as we're administering Papua New Guinea. He made the offer. There's a cabinet submission where Salazar's correspondence is not shown to the rest of cabinet. They're deceived. And the cabinet submission says Salazar has not responded to correspondence. Lies. I've got the letters. They're not available in the Australian archives. They're available in Kew. Because Australia's foreign diplomats had a habit of passing a lot to the British, thank God. And Renouf, Alan Renouf, actually has always been criticised for not holding Whitlam back. He did his best. The British archives show that. So he in a way, improves in history, Alan Renouf does, not Richard Wilcott, who never will, in my view. Sorry, Richard, if you're here. So, you know, that's the Timor story. We've never been fair. And they helped our young soldiers in World War II. And my interest in it stemmed from the fact that one of those soldiers told me what a great race they were, that their Portuguese priests were put to death, etc., etc., etc. And then I read that we sold them out. I thought it was appalling. So as soon as I left the service, I offered I actually went to see Horta in 1976 in Paris, because I read an all-post cable saying no one is to grant a visa to the Che Guevara of the East, Southeast. And he's not to be approached, and no one's to give him a visa. Well, of course, you know what I did. I went straight down to the Sorbonne to see José speaking. Couldn't get to him. He was surrounded by smiling young women, all wanting his autograph, but eventually saw José and spoke to him, didn't tell him what I was doing in Paris, but told him, you know, don't do any bombs, don't run a struggle that way. And the strangest thing about Timor's liberation struggle, it's not strange, it's called a humane resistance, and Peter Cosgrove and I agree with this. You know, when we got there in 1999-2000, the Indonesian army's married quarters did not have a barbed wire fence around them in Dili. Could you imagine the Israeli army having no fence? So Chinana and his predecessors ran a humane resistance. And that's the reason why, when we went eventually to West Timor on a visit, Chinana was feted by the Indonesian generals. He ran a pretty humane resistance in the field against the Indonesians. There's been an attempt by Julie Bishop, sadly ascribed to by a few of our supporters, that the real issue we've got is with Indonesia, and if we don't make the deal and give up to Australia, Indonesia will get Greater Sunrise. That's nonsense. There's no chance of it. That's not going to happen. It's a furphy, and it's been a furphy being run out of DFAT again. It's not supported by our defence arrangements, and we shouldn't run with it. Finally, the issue at the moment of conciliation, it means that Australia's and Timor are back in discussions because the arbitration has been discontinued, and Australia and Timor are now back where they were. They're discussing matters. I can't comment on that. The future idea of fairness can be gauged by the fact that Witness K still doesn't have a passport. He is a man who's entitled to visit his children abroad, can't. He's a brave, courageous Australian. He's actually a veteran, a war veteran, very senior, and he has, ironically, the support of the Defence Intelligence Establishment, but Julie Bishop refuses him a passport.
Sure.
That matters before the Minister for Appeals Tribunal, Senator Brandis, the Attorney General, has appointed the President of that tribunal is Gary Humphries, Senator Gary Humphries, formerly, who was in Cabinet with me. And when I had one matter against George Brandis as a barrister, and when it finished, Gary Humphries, as his friend, came into the robing room. I'll always remember it, because there was a bit of an issue over the matter. But I didn't know George Brandis other than that he was a Brisbane silk, as we call them, and next thing I know, he's raiding my chambers. But so witness K depends on his passport from the Minister of Appeals Tribunal, chaired by former Senator Gary Humphries. There's nothing like the way Putin rides high at the moment in Washington and Canberra. That's all I can say. Thank you very much.